400 meters beneath the surface of the Sea of Okhotsk. Complete darkness. Water pressure so intense it would crush a human body instantly. The temperature hovers just above freezing. No light has reached this depth in millions of years. And there, resting on the ocean floor, clamped directly onto a Soviet communications cable, is something that shouldn't exist. A metal sphere, roughly the size of a compact car, waiting, listening, recording every secret the Soviet Navy transmits through the deep. This is Operation Ivy Bells. For more than a decade, it represented the crown jewel of American Cold War espionage, a technological marvel that gave the United States unprecedented access to the Soviet Union's most classified military communications. The operation required submarines to penetrate hostile waters, crews to risk their lives in conditions more dangerous than combat, and engineers to create devices that could survive in one of Earth's most hostile environments. But this story isn't just about technological triumph. It's about how one man's betrayal turned America's greatest intelligence achievement into one of its most devastating failures. It's about the submarine crews who operated in absolute secrecy, unable to tell even their families what they risked. And it's about how the hidden war beneath the waves shaped the outcome of the Cold War in ways the public would never understand. This is the day the ocean fell silent, and then began to speak. By 1967, the Cold War had settled into a dangerous equilibrium. The Soviet Union and United States possessed nuclear arsenals capable of ending civilization. Mutual assured destruction kept both superpowers from pulling the trigger. But beneath that nuclear standoff, a relentless competition continued: the war for information. During the first decade of the Cold War, American intelligence relied heavily on human spies and aerial reconnaissance. The U-2 spy plane had provided invaluable photographic intelligence of Soviet military facilities. Francis Gary Powers had become a household name after being shot down over Soviet airspace in 1960. But these traditional methods had severe limitations. Photography could show that a facility existed. It couldn't explain what was being discussed inside. It couldn't reveal strategic intentions. It couldn't penetrate the coded communications that coordinated Soviet military operations. And human spies? They could be turned, captured, or executed. The CIA had learned this lesson painfully, repeatedly. The National Security Agency, America's most secretive intelligence organization, understood that the future of espionage lay in signals intelligence. If America could intercept Soviet military communications directly, it would be like having a microphone in the Kremlin itself. Every order given, every concern raised, every assessment of American capabilities could be heard and analyzed. The problem was obvious. The most valuable Soviet communications didn't travel through the air where they could be intercepted by listening stations or spy ships. They traveled through undersea cables, cables that lay on the floor of Soviet territorial waters, cables the Soviets believed were completely secure because they ran through areas under constant military patrol. These undersea cables were the nervous system of Soviet military command in the Far East. They connected Pacific Fleet headquarters in Vladivostok with submarine bases at Petropavlovsk on the Kamchatka Peninsula. They transmitted orders that deployed ballistic missile submarines. They transmitted intelligence assessments that guided Soviet strategic thinking. They coordinated the movements of a naval force that represented an existential threat to American security. For the CIA and National Security Agency, the opportunity was almost unimaginable. If they could tap into these cables, they would gain access to the innermost thoughts of Soviet military commanders. But the cables lay 400 meters beneath the surface of the Sea of Okhotsk, in waters claimed and heavily patrolled by the Soviet Union. Any American operation would have to be conducted in absolute secrecy, in the heart of Soviet-controlled territory, without being detected. It seemed impossible. In 1967, a classified program was initiated to attempt precisely that. The concept originated within the National Security Agency. NSA analysts had tracked Soviet undersea cables for years, mapping their locations with impressive accuracy through signals intelligence and careful analysis of Soviet communications patterns. They knew where the cables lay. They knew what kind of information flowed through them. They knew these cables represented an intelligence goldmine. But knowing where a cable lies on the ocean floor and actually placing a listening device on it are two entirely different challenges. The technical obstacles were staggering. A tapping device would need to be placed directly on the cable at depths where water pressure reached 40 atmospheres, the equivalent of having 400 meters of ocean piled on top of it. The device would need to be completely watertight and capable of operating for months without maintenance. It would need to intercept communications traveling through the cable without introducing any detectable signal degradation that might alert Soviet engineers that their line had been compromised. The device would need to record thousands of hours of communications that would eventually need to be retrieved and brought back to the surface without leaving any trace. And all of this would have to be accomplished using submarines operating in complete secrecy in Soviet territorial waters, where detection could mean international incident or military confrontation. The National Security Agency turned to the Navy for help. What they needed was a submarine equipped with specialized mechanical arms, capable of precisely manipulating equipment in the absolute darkness of the deep ocean. What they needed was something that didn't exist. So they created it. The USS Halibut had been commissioned in 1960 as an attack submarine, but she had already lived a strange and secretive life. In the mid-1960s, she was converted into what the Navy euphemistically called a strategic missile observation platform. Her true mission was underwater reconnaissance of Soviet submarine bases and missile test facilities. The conversion required extensive modifications. Torpedo tubes were sealed. Electronic surveillance equipment was installed. The internal layout was reconfigured to accommodate specialized technical personnel. By 1967, the Navy recognized that the Halibut's true potential lay not in photography, but in something far more ambitious. The submarine was reconfigured again. Photographic equipment was removed. In its place, engineers installed specialized systems designed for underwater wiretapping. The Halibut was fitted with sophisticated mechanical arms that could be operated by technicians inside the submarine. She was outfitted with tools for attaching listening devices to undersea cables. She was being converted into the world's most advanced undersea eavesdropping platform. The operation was given the codename Ivy Bells. Creating a device capable of tapping an undersea cable without detection required solving problems that had never been addressed before. The Soviet cables were sophisticated pieces of engineering. Signals traveled through them in analog form, modulated onto carrier frequencies. Multiple channels of communication could exist simultaneously through frequency division multiplexing. To intercept these signals, a device would need to physically connect to the cable while inducing minimal electrical load. If the load was too great, it would degrade signal quality, potentially alerting Soviet engineers that something was wrong. The device needed to be essentially invisible to anyone monitoring the cable's performance. What the engineers created was a marvel of Cold War technology. The listening device was a titanium sphere approximately 8 feet in diameter, weighing several tons when pressurized. Titanium was chosen for its strength and resistance to corrosion in seawater. The sphere had to withstand crushing pressure while protecting delicate electronic equipment inside. The interior was pressurized to match external water pressure, critical for preventing implosion. Inside this sphere were high-fidelity electronic recording devices, initially using reel-to-reel magnetic tape running at extremely slow speeds to maximize recording duration. A single reel could capture several months of communications. The sphere was equipped with hydraulic arms that could grasp and hold the cable in place. Electronic sensors continuously measured signal characteristics to ensure the tap wasn't degrading communications quality. The tapping head itself used electromagnetic induction. It encircled the cable without puncturing the protective jacket or making direct electrical contact. This was critical. Any physical breach could be detected by Soviet engineers. The device had its own power supply, consisting of specially designed batteries that could last for months. It had thermal management systems to dissipate heat generated by electronics into the surrounding seawater. It was designed to be completely silent. No acoustic noise that could be detected by Soviet sonar, no electromagnetic radiation that could be picked up by surveillance systems, no visible light that could be seen by passing vessels. The entire assembly was mounted on a frame that could be anchored to the ocean floor. It was, in essence, a small, unmanned underwater laboratory dedicated to the single task of listening to and recording Soviet military communications. But creating the device was only the first challenge. Getting it to the cable and ensuring it functioned correctly would require an operation of extraordinary technical sophistication and courage. The target was carefully chosen. Intelligence analysts identified the primary cable connecting Soviet Pacific Fleet headquarters in Vladivostok with the submarine base at Petropavlovsk. This cable carried high-priority military communications. If it could be tapped, the intelligence yield would be transformational. On February 27, 1968, the USS Halibut departed Guam. Her crew knew they were about to undertake a mission unlike any other in submarine history. They weren't heading into combat. They weren't sailing toward a known enemy position. They were sailing into the heart of Soviet-controlled waters to place a listening device directly on Soviet military infrastructure. If discovered, the ramifications would be catastrophic. The route to the Sea of Okhotsk required passing through waters where Soviet naval activity was constant. Soviet destroyers and anti-submarine warfare frigates patrolled aggressively. The Halibut would have to remain undetected throughout her entire passage. It would have to approach the cable location without being discovered. It would have to carry out a complex technical operation on the ocean floor while maintaining vigilance for any approaching Soviet vessel. The Halibut's crew wasn't composed of ordinary submariners. This was a hand-picked team trained for extended underwater operations. They had expertise in electronics, mechanical engineering, and underwater technical operations. They understood the risks. They had trained extensively, but nothing could fully prepare them for what they were about to attempt. Commander John L. Nicholson commanded the operation. He navigated the Halibut through treacherous waters with meticulous precision. Charts showed Soviet naval bases, known patrol routes, and estimated sonar array positions. Every course correction, every speed adjustment was calculated to minimize the probability of detection. The passage south through the Bering Sea and into the Sea of Okhotsk was conducted with extreme caution. The Halibut remained submerged for the entire journey, traveling at optimal depths to avoid detection. The submarine's advanced sonar systems gave her advantages in stealth and detection capability, but she was venturing into waters where the Soviets had invested heavily in surveillance. The crew maintained absolute silence following protocols designed to minimize any acoustic signature. Unnecessary machinery was shut down. Crew members moved carefully to avoid creating noise. The submarine became a ghost, sliding through dark water toward its target. As the Halibut approached the cable location, tension aboard intensified. Sonar operators remained at their stations, constantly scanning for any indication that Soviet vessels had detected their presence. Any acoustic contact from a Soviet ship or submarine would trigger an immediate abort. The cable location had been precisely mapped by previous surveillance efforts and signal intelligence analysis. It lay approximately 400 meters below the surface, in an area regularly transited by Soviet warships but not known to have dedicated surveillance installations. Commander Nicholson ordered a slow, carefully controlled descent toward the ocean floor. At these depths, water pressure was approximately 40 atmospheres. The submarine's titanium hull was designed to withstand these pressures, but the descent required constant attention and monitoring. The Halibut's specialized sensing equipment became critical. The submarine's sonar and electronic detection systems searched for the target cable. The cable wouldn't show up as a distinct object on sonar. It was too small, and the ocean floor created too much background noise. Instead, the team relied on precise navigation calculations and marker signals to guide them to the correct coordinates. As the Halibut approached the ocean floor, Captain Nicholson ordered a careful survey. The submarine's cameras, powerful floodlights, and high-resolution sonar provided a detailed picture of the surroundings. The ocean floor was relatively flat, covered with silt and sediment. And there, visible to the trained eyes of the technicians monitoring the cameras, was the cable, a thick bundle of copper and insulation, running along the bottom like a strange artificial organism in an alien world. The moment of truth had arrived. The Halibut had to position herself directly over the cable and deploy the listening device with extraordinary precision. The submarine had to hold station in three-dimensional space while mechanical arms manipulated a multi-ton device onto the cable. Any miscalculation, any drift caused by ocean currents could result in disaster. Commander Nicholson positioned the Halibut with meticulous care. The submarine was suspended above the cable, her position maintained by careful adjustments to ballast and propulsion systems. Ocean currents at this depth were relatively gentle, but sufficient to move a 7,000-ton submarine, if not carefully controlled. Inside the submarine, the team responsible for deploying the listening device prepared for their critical task. These were among the most highly trained men in the U.S. Navy, operators of specialized mechanical arms who had spent hundreds of hours training for this operation. They knew the procedures intimately, but there was a profound difference between practicing in controlled environments and executing under real-world conditions in hostile territory. The mechanical arms extended from the Halibut's specially modified hull. Through camera monitors inside the submarine, operators could see their workspace illuminated by powerful lights. The listening device, the titanium sphere with its grasping hydraulic arms, was being carefully lowered toward the cable. The operators made constant micro-adjustments, watching the camera feed intently. The margin for error was minimal. If positioned even inches incorrectly, the clamp might miss the cable entirely or engage in a way that could damage both the device and the cable. Inch by inch, the device descended. Minutes felt like hours. The operators maintained absolute concentration, their hands making tiny corrections on the control systems. Finally, the tapping head made contact with the cable. The hydraulic clamp engaged, grasping the cable firmly but without crushing it. The device's sensors indicated that signal characteristics were normal. The tap wasn't degrading communications flowing through the cable. Everything was working as designed. The mechanical arms continued positioning the main body of the listening device onto the seafloor adjacent to the cable. The device was anchored in place using a specialized frame. Once secured, the mechanical arms released and withdrew into the submarine. The listening device was now in place, clamped to the Soviet Navy's primary communications cable, ready to begin recording military secrets. The Halibut's crew had accomplished the first part of their mission successfully. They had placed the device without being detected. But the operation wasn't over. Technical personnel inside the submarine conducted a series of tests, remotely activating the device's sensors, confirming the recording equipment was functioning correctly, verifying signal quality was acceptable. The data coming back was remarkable. The technicians could hear voice communications, teletype signals, and analog data streams flowing through the cable. The listening device was performing exactly as designed. It was recording conversations of Soviet Navy officers, intercepting commands that coordinated military operations, capturing the strategic thinking of the Soviet fleet. The mission was a complete success. After several hours of verification, Commander Nicholson ordered the Halibut to begin withdrawal. The submarine carefully maneuvered away from the cable, began her ascent toward shallower waters, and pointed her bow toward the open Pacific. The passage out was conducted with the same extreme caution as the passage in. The Halibut remained undetected throughout her withdrawal. She transited back through the Bering Sea and eventually returned to Guam on March 28, 1968. The first Ivy Bells operation was a stunning success. A listening device was now recording everything that passed through one of the Soviet Navy's most important communications cables. But this was just the beginning. The device was recording onto magnetic tape with finite capacity. Periodically, the Halibut would have to return to retrieve the recordings and replace the tapes. And with each return visit, the risks would increase. The intelligence flowing from that single listening device on the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk was extraordinary. American analysts were hearing conversations they were never meant to hear. Soviet Navy commanders discussing submarine deployments, technical officers debating weapons capabilities, admirals assessing American naval strength and weaknesses. American intelligence now had a window into Soviet military thinking that had never existed before. Every decision the Soviets made, every concern they raised, every assessment of American strength was being recorded and analyzed. It was intelligence gold. The success of the first recovery operation led to an ambitious expansion. If one cable could be tapped successfully, why not others? NSA analysts identified additional targets. New listening devices were manufactured. The Halibut would return again and again. This pattern of deployment, recovery, maintenance, and redeployment would continue for over a decade. Multiple listening devices were eventually placed on at least 6 different Soviet undersea cables, creating a network of espionage that provided comprehensive coverage of Soviet Navy communications throughout the Far East. But with each operation, the cumulative risk increased. The Soviets weren't blind. They were beginning to notice anomalies. Soviet engineers had started detecting strange signals on their communication cables. Nothing definitive, just subtle irregularities in signal propagation that shouldn't exist. Technical discussions began among Soviet Navy communications officers, whispered concerns about the possibility of compromised cables. In 1975, Soviet intelligence initiated a systematic review of their undersea communications infrastructure. A special commission was formed to investigate potential security breaches. Soviet engineers were dispatched to inspect cable termination points and routing areas. The Soviets discovered indications that something was wrong, but they couldn't pinpoint exactly what. The cables appeared intact. There were no obvious signs of physical tampering, yet the signal characteristics suggested interference. Soviet intelligence officials reported their suspicions to the Kremlin, but without concrete proof, the reports were treated with skepticism. The idea that American submarines could penetrate Soviet territorial waters, locate cables on the ocean floor, and attach sophisticated listening devices seemed too far-fetched. Meanwhile, the Halibut continued her missions. The submarine's crew had conducted so many transits into Soviet waters that the operation had begun to feel almost routine. Success breeds confidence, and confidence can breed complacency. In 1976, during another recovery operation, sonar operators aboard the Halibut detected something alarming. A Soviet anti-submarine warfare frigate was approaching their position. The frigate appeared to be conducting a routine patrol, but its course would bring it dangerously close to the submarine. Commander Graydon Lay, commanding the Halibut at that time, immediately ordered evasive action. The submarine altered course, increased depth, and attempted to maneuver away. The frigate's sonar began pinging actively, sweeping the water for underwater contacts. For several minutes, the Halibut and the Soviet frigate played a deadly game in the darkness. The submarine's acoustic signature had to be minimized to avoid detection. The crew shut down all non-essential systems. They moved with extreme care. They waited. The Soviet frigate continued its search pattern, but the Halibut's stealth technology gave her the advantage. After what seemed like an eternity, the frigate moved away, apparently having detected nothing unusual. Commander Lay kept the submarine submerged for hours afterward, allowing sonar operators to confirm the Soviet vessel had departed the area. Only then did he order the mission to resume. The encounter was a warning. The Soviets were conducting more intensive searches. They were clearly concerned about cable security. It was only a matter of time before they conducted a more systematic investigation that might reveal the listening devices. But the Halibut continued her missions. The intelligence was too valuable to abandon based on suspicion alone. What American intelligence didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the operation had already been compromised. Not by Soviet technical sophistication or tactical awareness, but by something far more dangerous: an American spy. John Anthony Walker was born on July 28, 1937, in Washington, D.C. He grew up in a military family and joined the U.S. Navy, serving as a communications officer. His career appeared entirely normal. He held a top-secret, sensitive compartmented information clearance, one of the highest security clearances in the U.S. government. He had access to the most sensitive secrets of the American Navy. Walker was, by most accounts, an ordinary man. He wasn't a true believer in communism like some Cold War spies. He wasn't motivated by ideology or political conviction. What motivated John Walker was money and the ego gratification of being a spy. In 1967, Walker's financial situation was dire. His marriage was failing, he had mounting debts. He needed money urgently. According to what Walker would later confess, he made the decision to sell American military secrets to the Soviet Union almost on impulse. He walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington and asked to speak to someone about selling classified information.
This decision, made in a moment of financial desperation, would prove to be one of the most consequential acts of espionage in Cold War history. The Soviets took Walker seriously immediately. They recognized the potential value of a source with his level of access to naval communications. He was recruited as a Soviet agent and given the code name Mole John. From 1967 until his arrest in 1985, John Walker systematically betrayed American military secrets to the Soviet Union. His primary value was his access to naval communications security material. Walker worked with facilities where he had access to the classified keys, algorithms, and procedures the Navy used to encrypt its communications. What Walker sold to the Soviets was devastating in scope and significance. He provided complete sets of encryption keys used by American warships to communicate with each other and with shore facilities. He provided technical information about encryption algorithms. He provided information about security procedures used to protect communications. He provided everything the Soviets needed to decrypt American naval communications in near real time. The impact cannot be overstated. With access to American naval encryption keys, the Soviets could read not only routine communications, but also strategic intelligence assessments, operational orders, and tactical communications during exercises and crises. They could understand American naval strategy. They could assess American capabilities and vulnerabilities. But Walker's greatest betrayal, the one that would ultimately doom Operation Ivy Bells, was his revelation of classified intelligence collection programs. Among the secrets Walker sold to the Soviets was detailed information about Operation Ivy Bells. He provided technical details about the listening devices. He provided information about their locations. He provided information about the schedule and pattern of recovery operations conducted by the Halibut. He knew where the listening devices were located. He knew which cables were being tapped. He knew the technical specifications, and he passed all of this information to his Soviet handlers. The Soviets now knew exactly what the Americans were doing. They knew their most secret communications were being intercepted. They knew about the USS Halibut. They knew about the listening devices on their cables. They knew about the entire extraordinarily complex and expensive intelligence operation. Walker's information was so valuable that the Soviets took extraordinary precautions to protect him as a source. They didn't immediately reveal that they knew about Operation Ivy Bells. That would lead to an investigation into how the information had been compromised, potentially exposing Walker. Instead, they waited. They continued reading American encrypted communications. They continued monitoring Ivy Bells operations. They learned everything they could about American intelligence capabilities while keeping their source protected. But eventually, they decided the time had come to reveal their knowledge. In October 1978, a Soviet minesweeper operating in the Sea of Okhotsk detected an unusual contact on the ocean floor. The Soviets dispatched a diving expedition to investigate. The divers recovered a large spherical object attached to one of their undersea cables. The object was obviously American. It bore American markings. It contained American electronics. When Soviet engineers disassembled the device and examined its contents, they found the recording equipment, the cable tap mechanism, and extensive documentation that made the purpose clear. The Soviets photographed the device extensively. They documented its construction and capabilities. They documented the cable tap mechanism. They documented the sophisticated electronics inside. They documented the battery power system. They documented the recording equipment. Then, they made it public. Soviet officials announced they had discovered an American espionage device on Soviet communications cables. They displayed photographs to international journalists. They provided technical details about how the device functioned. They made clear that Americans had been conducting a comprehensive wiretapping operation for over a decade. The revelation was both a propaganda victory and a practical one. The discovery forced the Americans to acknowledge the operation. The revelation spread through the intelligence community. Questions were immediately raised about how the Soviets had known exactly where to find the device. How had they discovered Operation Ivy Bells? Initial American investigations focused on possible security breaches in the classified compartments where Ivy Bells was discussed. Suspicion fell on various officials and officers who had been briefed on the operation. Polygraph tests were conducted. Extensive counterintelligence investigations were launched, but the true source of the compromise, John Walker, remained hidden for years. Walker continued working for the Soviets throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s. He had expanded his spy ring to include other Navy officers, including his own son, Michael. His brother Arthur also joined the operation. So did Jerry Whitworth, a friend and fellow communications specialist. The Walker spy ring was extraordinarily successful at compromising American naval communications for over 17 years before it was finally discovered. With Operation Ivy Bells compromised, the U.S. faced an immediate crisis. The listening devices could no longer be safely maintained or recovered. The Soviet Navy now knew exactly what the Americans were doing and where the devices were located. Any attempt to retrieve them would almost result in the capture of the recovery submarine. The decision was made to abandon Operation Ivy Bells. The listening devices that had been placed on Soviet cables would remain where they were, inactive and no longer serving any purpose. The USS Halibut's mission as an espionage platform was essentially over. The operation that had yielded some of the most valuable intelligence of the Cold War was terminated. The recovery of the listening device and the revelation of Ivy Bells had several immediate consequences. First, it forced the U.S. Navy to fundamentally reconsider its approach to signals intelligence gathering. The Soviets began implementing additional security measures. Soviet undersea cables were moved to new locations. Alternative communications methods were developed. Redundancy was built into systems. Second, it revealed the scope of American espionage capabilities to the Soviets and indirectly to the world. The revelation demonstrated the sophistication of American technical intelligence. It showed the U.S. was willing to conduct covert operations in Soviet territorial waters. It demonstrated that American submarines could operate in Soviet-controlled areas without detection. Third, the revelation exposed a fundamental vulnerability in American national security. A single individual with access to classified information could compromise the most sophisticated intelligence operations. The investigation into how Ivy Bells had been compromised would have far-reaching implications. The Ivy Bells operation was officially terminated in 1982, though final details weren't revealed until years later. The listening devices that had been placed on Soviet cables were never recovered. They remain on the ocean floor to this day, silent sentinels of an era that has passed. For the American intelligence community, the loss created a significant gap. The signals intelligence derived from Ivy Bells had provided critical insights available from no other source. American analysts and military planners had relied on this information for years. The sudden loss left gaps in understanding of Soviet naval capabilities and intentions. Increased emphasis was placed on satellite reconnaissance of Soviet naval installations. Enhanced effort was directed toward recruiting human intelligence sources. Signals intelligence collection was refocused on radio communications, which, while less sensitive than cable communications, could still provide valuable information. The incident also prompted a thorough investigation into the security of American intelligence compartments. How had information about Ivy Bells been compromised? The initial investigation focused on counterintelligence within the intelligence community. Suspicion fell on various officials and officers who had been briefed on Ivy Bells. It was only through the discovery of John Walker's espionage activities years later that the true source became clear. The arrest of John Walker came not through American counterintelligence efforts, but through a tip from an unexpected source: his ex-wife, Barbara Walker. Barbara had been aware of her husband's espionage activities, though she hadn't participated directly. When her marriage to John deteriorated, Barbara decided to report his activities to the FBI. She walked into an FBI office and told agents about her husband's Soviet espionage. She provided details about how Walker had been stealing classified information and passing it to the Soviets. She provided information about meeting locations. She provided information about the amounts of money Walker had been receiving. The FBI took her information seriously and immediately initiated an investigation. Agents began surveillance of John Walker. They identified additional members of the spy ring through surveillance. They coordinated with the Navy to determine what classified material Walker and his accomplices had accessed. The investigation revealed the full scope of the Walker spy ring's activities. John Walker had been stealing classified material for 18 years. He had recruited his son, Michael, his brother Arthur, and Jerry Whitworth into the operation. Together, they had stolen massive quantities of classified information and passed it to the Soviets. The investigation also revealed what had been compromised. The encryption keys Walker provided had given the Soviets the ability to decrypt American naval communications for years. The Soviets had used this access to read American military communications about naval operations, military strategy, and weapons development.
John Walker was arrested on May 20, 1985. He was charged with espionage and related crimes. He confessed to his activities and agreed to cooperate with the FBI investigation. His confession revealed the full scope of the spy ring's operations. John Walker was convicted of espionage and sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. His son Michael was also convicted and sentenced to life. Jerry Whitworth was convicted and sentenced to 365 years in prison. Arthur Walker received a shorter sentence. The arrest created a massive shock in the intelligence community. The realization that such a damaging spy had operated undetected for nearly 18 years forced a comprehensive reassessment of counterintelligence procedures throughout the American intelligence and military establishment. In the aftermath of Walker's arrest, American officials were forced to conduct a comprehensive damage assessment. What had been compromised? How had Soviet knowledge of American information affected the Cold War? What damage might continue to unfold? The assessment revealed that virtually all American naval communications during the years Walker provided encryption keys had been vulnerable to Soviet decryption. The Soviets possessed near real-time access to American naval communications for years. They could read strategic assessments, operational orders, and tactical communications. The implications were profound. Throughout the period Walker was spying, American military planners operated under the assumption their communications were secure. In reality, the Soviets were reading many of those communications directly. Soviet military planners made decisions based on accurate knowledge of American plans and capabilities. The assessment identified specific operations and crises where Soviet knowledge might have altered outcomes. During various Cold War confrontations, American naval forces positioned themselves based on operational plans transmitted through compromised communications. The Soviets knew American naval positions. Did this knowledge affect how Soviet leaders assessed American resolve? During the Vietnam War, American naval operations were coordinated through communications Walker had compromised.
The Soviets knew about American naval deployments off Vietnam. They knew about carrier task force movements. They knew about American tactical operations. This intelligence gave the Soviets insights into American military capabilities that should have been secret. The assessment identified vulnerabilities in other programs as well. If the Walker spy ring operated undetected for 18 years, how many other Soviet spies might be operating within American intelligence and military organizations? These questions drove intensified counterintelligence efforts throughout the remainder of the 1980s. Additional Soviet moles were discovered and arrested. American counterintelligence procedures were substantially revised. New security procedures were implemented in sensitive compartments. Personnel security investigations were expanded. The assessment also considered long-term strategic implications. For 18 years, the Soviet Union enjoyed a significant intelligence advantage. They read American military communications. They understood American military thinking. They could anticipate American actions and reactions. Had this advantage affected the outcome of Cold War crises? Had it prolonged the Cold War by making Soviet leaders more aggressive? Or had it contributed to Soviet caution, giving them accurate information about American capabilities that prevented actions that would have provoked aggressive American responses? The answers weren't clear. The assessment could establish what had been compromised, but determining exactly how that compromise affected Cold War events remained difficult.
Nicholson's decision to proceed reflected the confidence he had in his crew and his understanding of the importance of the intelligence Ivy Bells could provide. It also reflected the culture of the submarine service, where officers and men are trained to accept extraordinary risks in service of their nation. The technical specialists aboard the Halibut, the men who operated the mechanical arms and deployed the listening devices, faced unique risks. They had to maintain intense concentration while performing complex technical operations in absolute darkness, with only camera monitors and sonar to guide them. They had to accomplish delicate maneuvers with machinery never used this way before. One of the most dangerous aspects was the possibility that the listening device could malfunction or fail to deploy properly. If this happened, the Halibut would have to attempt repairs or retrieve the device, extending the time on station over the cable. Extended time meant increased risk of detection. The crew members understood these risks, but they also understood the intelligence being gathered was vital to national security. They accepted the risks as part of their duty. They maintained the discipline and focus necessary to conduct operations successfully in hostile waters. For many of the Halibut's crew members, service on Ivy Bells missions was the most significant contribution they would make to the Cold War. It was also a contribution they could never publicly acknowledge. When they returned from missions, they couldn't discuss what they'd done. They couldn't tell their families about their service. They couldn't receive public recognition or commendation for their achievements. This anonymity was part of the sacrifice demanded by classified intelligence operations. The men who served aboard the Halibut during Ivy Bells missions were performing some of the most important intelligence work of the Cold War, but doing so in complete secrecy, with no possibility of public acknowledgement. They were warriors in a silent war. The story of the Walker spy ring adds another dimension to the tragedy of Operation Ivy Bells. John Walker didn't just betray an intelligence program, he betrayed the men who risked their lives to make it successful. Walker recruited his own family members into espionage. His son Michael Walker was a communications officer in the Navy with access to naval communications equipment and classified materials. John Walker recruited his son, offering him money in exchange for providing classified material. Michael initially resisted. He understood the seriousness of espionage and was reluctant to betray his country.
But eventually, pressured by his father and enticed by financial incentives, Michael agreed to participate. John Walker's brother, Arthur Walker, also joined the operation. Arthur worked as a Navy civilian employee with access to classified naval communications. He was recruited to provide classified material to pass to the Soviets. Jerry Whitworth, a former Navy communications specialist, was also brought into the ring. Whitworth had served in the Navy and maintained contacts with active duty personnel. He helped gather classified material and pass it to John Walker for transmission to the Soviets. The family dynamic added a disturbing dimension to the spy ring. John Walker essentially coerced his son into espionage through a combination of financial pressure and family manipulation. Michael Walker served in the Navy partly because of his father's influence, and his father leveraged this relationship to recruit him into betrayal. The Soviets were so pleased with Walker's intelligence that they awarded him the Order of the Red Banner, one of the Soviet Union's highest military honors. Walker received tens of thousands of dollars in payment for the classified material he provided. He lived a relatively comfortable life supported by Soviet payments, at least until his arrest. The recruitment methods used by the Soviets were straightforward. They identified a vulnerable individual with financial problems and direct access to valuable classified material. They made contact, offered substantial financial incentives, and gradually expanded the scope of his activities. Once Walker was committed through financial incentives and by providing increasingly sensitive material, the Soviets had established a long-term source. The arrest came not through American counterintelligence, but through Walker's ex-wife, Barbara. Barbara had been aware of her husband's espionage activities, though she hadn't participated. When her marriage deteriorated, she decided to report him to the FBI. She walked into an FBI office and told agents about her husband's Soviet espionage. She provided details about how Walker stole information and passed it to the Soviets. She provided information about meeting locations and the amounts of money Walker received. Her decision to come forward finally ended one of the most damaging spy operations in American history. The lessons learned from Operation Ivy Bells and its compromise continued to shape American intelligence operations today. These lessons have influenced how the intelligence community approaches sensitive programs and how it protects classified information. The first lesson is the importance of operational compartmentalization. Operation Ivy Bells was ultimately compromised because information about it was shared with individuals who had access to classified information but didn't have a need to know about Ivy Bells specifically. John Walker wasn't directly involved in Ivy Bells operations, but he had access to information revealing the operation's details. Stricter compartmentalization might have prevented this information from reaching Walker. The second lesson is the constant threat posed by insider threats. The most sophisticated security procedures cannot prevent an individual with legitimate access from compromising information. Background checks, polygraph examinations, and counterintelligence investigations are valuable tools, but they cannot guarantee that no insider will betray classified information to foreign powers. The third lesson is the value of diversified intelligence collection methods. The loss of Ivy Bells forced the American intelligence community to develop alternative sources of intelligence about Soviet naval capabilities and intentions. This diversification made American intelligence collection more resilient to compromise or loss of any single source. The fourth lesson is the importance of protecting technical intelligence sources and methods. The revelation of Operation Ivy Bells demonstrated American technical capabilities to the Soviets, allowing them to develop countermeasures. In future operations, protecting the details of how intelligence is collected became a priority. not just protecting the intelligence itself. The fifth lesson is the potential for individuals to cause significant damage to national security. John Walker's espionage contributed to compromising multiple intelligence programs and weapons systems. His betrayal had impacts that rippled through American military operations for decades. This recognition led to enhanced attention to insider threat prevention and detection. In many ways, Operation Ivy Bells represents the hidden war that raged beneath the surface during the Cold War. While the world watched the skies for reconnaissance aircraft and focused on nuclear-armed missiles and warships, a silent battle was taking place in the crushing darkness of the ocean depths. American submarines were placing listening devices on Soviet communications cables. Soviet forces were developing countermeasures. Soviet intelligence was attempting to understand the nature of the threat. American intelligence was analyzing intercepted Soviet communications. This underwater war was waged with minimal publicity and minimal recognition by the general public. The stakes were extraordinarily high. The intelligence obtained from Ivy Bells had the potential to shape American military strategy and tactical decisions. The risks were also extraordinarily high. Submarine crews conducting operations were operating in Soviet territorial waters, where detection would mean international incident or worse. The operation ultimately failed not because of Soviet technical superiority or tactical awareness, but because an American spy gave away all its secrets. This is perhaps the most profound lesson of Ivy Bells, that intelligence operations, no matter how technically sophisticated and tactically sound, are ultimately vulnerable to human betrayal. The story of Operation Ivy Bells didn't end with its termination in 1982 or even with the arrest of John Walker in 1985. In many ways, the consequences have continued to unfold over the decades since the Cold War ended. The intelligence obtained from Operation Ivy Bells before it was compromised provided American military planners with critical insights into Soviet naval capabilities. This information shaped American naval strategy throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s. American anti-submarine warfare tactics were refined based on knowledge of Soviet submarine capabilities obtained through Ivy Bells. American naval deployments were planned with knowledge of Soviet naval operations obtained through Ivy Bells intercepts. The loss of Ivy Bells, when ultimately compromised, created a gap in American intelligence that took years to fill through alternative sources. New satellites were developed to monitor Soviet naval activities. Enhanced efforts were directed toward recruiting human intelligence sources in the Soviet military. Alternative signals intelligence collection methods were employed to try to replace the coverage Ivy Bells had provided. The Walker case forced recognition of how successful Soviet espionage had been against the United States. The American intelligence and military establishments had to acknowledge that Soviet spies had penetrated to the highest levels of sensitive programs. This recognition led to comprehensive reassessment of counterintelligence procedures and personnel security measures. The revelations also forced both American and Soviet forces to reassess undersea surveillance capabilities. For the Americans, losing Ivy Bells meant losing access to the most valuable source of Soviet Navy communications. For the Soviets, discovering the listening devices forced a fundamental review of their communications security. The Soviets implemented several measures to address vulnerabilities. New undersea cables were routed along different paths, reducing predictability. Alternative communication methods were developed, with some strategic communications switched to more secure channels not transmitted through fixed undersea cables. The Soviets began conducting regular patrols of cable routes, looking for evidence of tampering. They developed technical countermeasures to detect physical taps on cables, including monitoring systems that would detect changes in signal characteristics. The technical capabilities demonstrated by Ivy Bells would influence American submarine development and intelligence collection operations for decades. The lessons learned about undersea operations, mechanical manipulation of equipment at extreme depths, and long-term maintenance of surveillance devices in hostile environments all contributed to future programs. Operation Ivy Bells remained classified for over a decade after its termination. The general public was largely unaware of the operation even after the recovery of the listening device and Soviet revelation of American espionage activities. The details, the location of cables, technical specifications of listening devices, operational procedures, and intelligence derived from the operation remained tightly compartmented within the intelligence community. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War and the release of declassified information, that the full story became publicly known. Books were written about the operation. Documentary accounts were produced. The operation was studied by intelligence analysts as a landmark achievement in Cold War espionage. The declassification revealed the sophistication of American intelligence collection capabilities. It demonstrated that the United States had been willing to conduct operations in Soviet territorial waters to obtain intelligence. It demonstrated the technical capabilities American engineers and intelligence professionals had developed. The legacy of Ivy Bells is complex. On one hand, it represents one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations ever conducted by the United States. American technical ingenuity, combined with the courage of submarine crews willing to operate in hostile waters, produced an intelligence source of extraordinary value. The listening devices were marvels of engineering, capable of operating in harsh undersea environments for extended periods of time. On the other hand, Ivy Bells also represents the vulnerability of even the most sophisticated operations to compromise. The operation was ultimately defeated not by Soviet technology or tactics, but by a single American spy who sold its secrets. John Walker's betrayal demonstrates how a determined individual with access to classified information can compromise an entire intelligence program. The operation had a profound impact on how the U.S. intelligence community approached signals intelligence collection. It demonstrated the value of undersea cable tapping as an intelligence source. It also demonstrated the difficulties and dangers associated with maintaining such operations. After Ivy Bells, the American intelligence community developed a more diversified approach to signals intelligence collection, relying less on any single source and maintaining operational compartmentalization more carefully. Today, the listening devices that were placed during Operation Ivy Bells remain on the ocean floor of the Sea of Okhotsk. They remain silent, no longer recording. They remain hidden beneath hundreds of meters of ocean, inaccessible and forgotten by the world above. They are monuments to an era of espionage that has passed, reminders of the lengths nations will go to gain advantage over their adversaries, silent witnesses to the courage of the men who placed them there and the betrayal that rendered them obsolete. 400 meters beneath the surface, in complete darkness, under crushing pressure, these titanium spheres sit anchored to cables that may no longer even carry communications. The ocean floor has likely covered them with sediment. Marine life may have made them home. The technology inside, once cutting edge, is now antiquated. But they remain as testimony to what was achieved and what was lost. The men who served aboard the USS Halibut during the Ivy Bells missions performed some of the most dangerous and important work of the Cold War. They operated in conditions more hazardous than combat, in waters where a single mistake meant certain death. They maintained absolute secrecy, unable to discuss their service with anyone outside their compartmented world. For their contributions to Operation Ivy Bells, these submarine crews received neither public recognition nor visible commendations. Their service remained classified and compartmented. They couldn't discuss their missions with family members or colleagues. The risks they took and the contributions they made to national security remained hidden from public view. They were the silent warriors of the Cold War, the men who fought not with weapons but with technology and courage, the men who understood that sometimes the greatest contributions to national security are the ones that can never be acknowledged. The discovery of Operation Ivy Bells and the subsequent revelation of John Walker's espionage had broader implications for Cold War relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. The revelation of the listening devices demonstrated to the Soviets that Americans were conducting aggressive intelligence operations against them. It reinforced Soviet concerns about American intentions and capabilities. The Soviets responded with increased investment in their own signals intelligence capabilities and enhanced security measures for communication systems. The discovery also provided Soviet propaganda with material for anti-American messaging, emphasizing American imperialism and violation of Soviet sovereignty.
For the American intelligence community, the discovery of Ivy Bells and the Walker espionage case prompted fundamental reassessment of how classified information was compartmented and protected. New procedures were implemented to reduce vulnerability of intelligence programs to compromise by insider threats. Counterintelligence operations were intensified to identify additional Soviet moles within American intelligence and military organizations. The Walker case became a turning point in American counterintelligence. It demonstrated that traditional security clearance procedures and polygraph examinations were not sufficient to detect all insider threats. New methods were developed to identify individuals who might be vulnerable to recruitment by foreign intelligence services. Enhanced monitoring procedures were implemented in sensitive compartments where classified information was handled. The case also had implications for American understanding of how much damage Soviet espionage might have caused to other programs and military operations. If Walker had been able to compromise American naval communications encryption for 18 years without detection, how many other Soviet spies might be operating undetected within American intelligence and military organizations? This question drove intensified counterintelligence investigations throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s. Additional Soviet moles were discovered and arrested. The intelligence community was forced to acknowledge that Soviet espionage against the United States had been far more successful and pervasive than previously understood. The consequences of Operation Ivy Bells and its compromise continue to shape intelligence operations and national security policy today. Modern intelligence operations still rely heavily on signals intelligence collection, building on foundations established by Cold War-era programs like Ivy Bells. Contemporary operations use satellite-based and sophisticated electronic eavesdropping equipment rather than undersea listening devices, but the basic principle remains. Intercepting and analyzing adversary communications provides invaluable intelligence for national security decision-making. The vulnerability to insider threats revealed by the Walker case continues to drive enhanced counterintelligence efforts. American intelligence and military organizations now conduct more comprehensive background investigations, more frequent polygraph examinations, and more rigorous security procedures. Personnel in sensitive positions are subject to enhanced monitoring and investigation. The compartmentalization procedures developed in response to Ivy Bell's compromise have been applied across the intelligence community.
Intelligence programs are now compartmented more carefully, with access limited to those with direct need to know. Different elements of intelligence programs are maintained in separate compartments, so that compromise of one compartment doesn't necessarily compromise the entire program. The lessons of Ivy Bells have also shaped international law and agreements regarding espionage and intelligence collection. While nations haven't formally renounced intelligence gathering, the revelation of operations like Ivy Bells has prompted diplomatic discussions about limits and boundaries. International bodies have debated the legality and ethics of conducting espionage operations in territorial waters or airspace. The story of Operation Ivy Bells reminds contemporary intelligence professionals and military leaders of the human dimension of intelligence work. The operation was conducted by ordinary men asked to do extraordinary things in service of their nation. They accepted tremendous risks. They operated in complete secrecy. They couldn't receive public recognition for their contributions. Yet they performed their duties with professionalism and dedication. The operation also reminds us that intelligence operations, no matter how technically sophisticated and carefully planned, remain vulnerable to human betrayal. This vulnerability remains as relevant today as it was during the Cold War. The threat of insider compromise continues to be one of the most serious challenges facing the intelligence community. Operation Ivy Bells represents one of the most remarkable intelligence achievements of the Cold War, yet it remains relatively unknown to the general public. For more than a decade, American submarines placed listening devices on the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk, eavesdropping on the Soviet Navy's most secret communications. These operations required extraordinary courage, technical sophistication, and dedication to national security. The operation demonstrated American technical capabilities and operational courage. It demonstrated the value of signals intelligence for national security. It provided American military and intelligence officials with critical information about Soviet capabilities and intentions that shaped strategic planning throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. But the operation also demonstrated the constant vulnerability of intelligence programs to compromise by individuals willing to betray their country. John Walker's Espionage stands as a stark warning about the damage a single insider can cause. No security procedure, no matter how strict, can guarantee that individuals with access to classified information won't sell secrets to foreign powers. The compromise of Ivy Bells through Walker's betrayal had consequences that extended far beyond the loss of a single intelligence program. It affected American strategic planning. It influenced Cold War dynamics. It shaped how the intelligence community approached future operations. It drove reforms in counterintelligence procedures that continue to this day. The listening devices remain on the ocean floor as silent monuments to this extraordinary chapter of Cold War history. They remain hidden in darkness, covered by sediment, forgotten by the world above. But they stand as testimony to what was achieved by the men who placed them there and what was lost through betrayal. The ocean kept its silence for many years after that day in October 1978 when Soviet forces recovered the first listening device. But eventually the truth emerged. The story of Operation Ivy Bells, of achievement and betrayal, of courage and compromise, of technical sophistication and human weakness became part of the historical record. It's a story that continues to resonate through the intelligence community. A story that reminds us of the extraordinary lengths nations will go to obtain their adversaries' secrets. A story that demonstrates both the power of human ingenuity and the vulnerability created by human betrayal. The men who conducted Operation Ivy Bells were warriors in a silent war. They fought not with weapons, but with technology and determination. They risked their lives in the crushing darkness of the deep ocean, operating in hostile waters, knowing that discovery could mean disaster. They maintained absolute secrecy, unable to share their experiences or receive recognition for their service. They were the unsung heroes of the Cold War, the submariners who placed listening devices on Soviet cables, the engineers who designed those remarkable devices, the intelligence analysts who processed the thousands of hours of intercepted communications, the commanders who made the decision to conduct these dangerous operations despite the risks. And in the end, their achievements were compromised not by Soviet technical superiority or military prowess, but by an American who valued money more than loyalty, by a man who sold their secrets and the secrets of his nation for financial gain. This is the final lesson of Operation Ivy Bells, that in the world of intelligence operations, the greatest threats often come not from adversaries abroad, but from betrayers within. That technology and courage and sophistication mean nothing if the secrets that make them possible cannot be protected. That the silent war beneath the waves was ultimately lost not in the darkness of the deep ocean, but in the moral darkness of one man's betrayal. 400 meters beneath the surface of the Sea of Okhotsk, the listening devices remain, silent, forgotten, monuments to an era that has passed and lessons that endure. The ocean fell silent on that day in 1978 when Soviet forces recovered the first listening device. But eventually the truth emerged, the story of Operation Ivy Bells, of achievement and betrayal, of courage and compromise, of technical sophistication and human weakness became part of the historical record. It's a story that continues to resonate through the intelligence community, a story that reminds us of the extraordinary lengths nations will go to obtain their adversaries' secrets, a story that demonstrates both the power of human ingenuity and the vulnerability created by human betrayal.